Okay, we will be starting now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the OECD Environment, Health and Safety Division of the Environment Directorate. I'm Nathalie Delrue, Administrator to the Adverse Outcome Pathway Program. We will be presenting today the basis for AOP cooperation between scientific journals and the OECD, and discuss the lessons learned so far. During the Q&A session, we'll give priority to live questions. So to ask a question, you'll have to raise your hand when we open the Q&A session. The comments will be taken in the order of the hands raised. And you can also send your questions or comments at any time during the talks via the Q&A function in the Zoom control panel. If we don't have time to address them, the written questions will get back to you after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available in the next few days on the OECD public website. So I would like to welcome our four panelists, Dan Villeneuve from the US Environmental Protection Agency. He will present the AOP framework and challenges being encountered. Clemens Whitware from the European Commission Joint Research Center. He will focus on the importance of an increased cooperation between all stakeholders in order to promote the application of the AOP framework. I will present the AOP review principles and will describe how the cooperation between OECD and scientific journals is formalized in the terms of a memorandum of understanding. And last but not least, Dries Knappen from University of Antwerp, Belgium, and Jason O'Brien from the National Wildlife Research Center in Canada will present the lessons learned from the pilot study conducted by two scientific journals, Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, also known as ET&C, and Environmental and Molecular Metagenesis, EMM. And they will also present how the journal review process was optimized in the context of the AOP review. Our four panelists are very active members of the expert group overseeing the OECD Adverse Outcome Pathway Development Program. They have been supported the program since its beginning, and they have a great knowledge of the AOP framework. So I would like to thank them very much for their time and their participation in the webinar. And with this, I will hand over to our first speaker, Dan Villeneuve, for a presentation of the AOP framework. So Dan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Natalie. And hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I'm going to be providing a brief introduction to the Adverse Outcome Pathway Framework, and specifically be talking about some overview of the framework as well as some of the challenges we faced in implementing this framework. So although the AOP framework itself has much broader application, the development of the framework has been motivated by a paradigm shift in chemical safety assessment, really a transition from a system of chemical safety assessment that was really based on direct observation of concentrations at which chemicals, upon exposure to intact organisms, can cause adverse effects in those organisms. This approach to chemical safety assessment was largely effective, but it's also very costly, time-consuming, animal-intensive, and at the end of the day, provides little mechanistic insight that can be translated to other chemicals that may act on organisms the same way. And so there's been an ongoing effort within our field to shift to the use of so-called new approach methodologies, which really look to alternatives to intact animal studies, types of things that we can do in higher throughput using automation, liquid handling, robotics, etc., to look at the ways that chemicals can interact with different biological targets or pathways by monitoring things like altered enzyme activities, receptor binding, gene expression, alterations in hormone concentrations, etc. The caveat to this approach is that it requires knowledge and evidence-based inference to interpret what these data mean in terms of the potential adverse effects on organisms. And so this approach is a bit like going to a physician and having a series of medical diagnostic tests run, some blood work, for example. It's really, for most patients, we rely on the doctor to explain what those results mean directly to our health. What does that mean in terms of risks of various health outcomes? And that relies on a lot of specialized expertise and knowledge that the doctor has been exposed to over time that allows them to interpret what these test results mean. And so in the context of chemical safety assessment or other decision-making contexts, how do we accumulate this knowledge and how do we make this kind of scientific information accessible to the people that need to make decisions based on it? Well, the scientific enterprise has generated extensive data and information, and that enterprise continues. We have decades of research and testing data available to us. There are hundreds of articles being published daily, and the global scientific output is doubling every 9 years. So there's this exponential growth of scientific information. But the question is that science actually informing decision making? This information, while it's all out there, is also highly dispersed. It has variable relevance and quality. It's found in journal articles, in textbooks, notebooks, different online databases, etc. And even for subject matter experts, it can be really time consuming and challenging to look at the breadth of all this information and assemble it to address different questions we may have or help support science-based decision making, let alone for non-experts in a field to try and pull that information together and digest it to make decisions. And so that's the kind of challenge that many of our colleagues who are involved in policy and environmental decision, regulatory decision making, etc., face in trying to get a handle on all this scientific information and put those pieces together in order to support a decision. And so the adverse outcome pathway framework is really designed to help with that process. It's basically a collection of knowledge and evidence that's organized a particular way, in a systematic way, according to a series of principles that helps to synthesize and communicate a body of scientific knowledge that helps us translate from these sort of rapid diagnostic measurements that we can make pertaining to bioactivity of chemicals, for example, and translate what that might mean to human health or environmental impacts and so on. And we can also apply this framework to a variety of other applications, like, for example, looking at impacts of exposure to viruses or disease, impacts of radiation, or other effects on biology. And so this pathway is basically arranged around 2 key units of information. The first of those are what we call key events that are represented by the boxes here in this figure. And each of these key events is essentially a measurement that we can make. So it's an observation of the biology that we can make to sort of see that the biological system's been perturbed or can be perturbed by a given substance or stressor. And then we can track the progression through various biological milestones, if you will, along the path toward an ultimate adverse effect. Perhaps the more important part of the framework is actually these arrows that are represented here, which we call key event relationships. And this is really the scientific evidence and scientific understanding that allows us to draw inference along this pathway and to say, if we see an impact on this enzyme activity here, that's going to translate into reduced production of a particular hormone, for example. That hormone plays a critical role in a reproductive process. And so ultimately we might impair reproduction. And so these arrows basically lay out the scientific support and evidence for that. We organize all this information based on a number of key principles of adverse outcome pathway development. The first is that we don't describe AOPs in a very stressor specific way. We don't develop an AOP specific to a chemical or specific to a virus, for example, but rather we look at all potential stressors that can act on the biology in a similar manner and try to capture the biological, generalizable biological response to those perturbations or that stressor. We talk about AOPs as being modular because we organize this information again into two basic building blocks: the key events, so this description of the measurements we can make, and then key event relationships that are the evidence and the understanding that allows us to draw inference from one of those milestone measurements to another. The third principle is that an adverse outcome pathway, which basically is represented by a single series of events that link a particular initiating event, so where some stressor first causes a perturbation to the biological system, and the adverse outcome of concern. So one series of these events is basically described as an adverse outcome pathway, and we recognize this as just a pragmatic unit of development and evaluation. This is a tractable amount of information for an individual or an author or a group to assemble, and it's the basic unit that can be used for decision making because we can extrapolate from the things we're measuring to the outcomes that we care about. But we recognize that this is a simplification and that, if we perturb a biological system, there can be many different outcomes, many different consequences, and they're not all captured in this one sort of linear description. And so we capture that greater complexity of the biology through the assembly of adverse outcome pathway networks, based on this idea that this framework is modular and that various adverse outcome pathways can share key events or share key event relationships. As we link that information together, we actually build de facto networks that capture this more complex biology. The final principle is that AOPs are living documents, and as such, because they're just a synthesis of knowledge, information, and evidence, they can be expected to evolve over time as our knowledge, as the science evolves. We assemble this information using an online system called the AOP Wiki. You can access it through the link here. Basically, this AOP Wiki allows us to capture this information in this modular framework as different types of pages in the AOP Wiki, link them together into these various AOPs and AOP networks by sharing common key event and key event relationship pages. And this allows somebody to go in and describe one of these key events or one of these key event relationships. Others that may be constructing AOPs of their own can link to that already existing information, build upon it. And so this really allows for a potential crowdsourcing approach to gathering all of this information, collecting it, synthesizing it, and collating it. The AOP Knowledge Base was really established around 2014, and we've been tracking the growth of the AOP Knowledge Base since 2018. And we can see over time that we've seen steady growth in the number of adverse outcome pathways that are under development in the AOP Wiki, with an average of about 50 new adverse outcome pathways being added every year. However, of those 50 AOPs, only 19 have gone through a process of formal scientific review and endorsement by the OECD, the body that oversees the AOP development program. And many of these are at different stages of development. Some are just a graphical representation without any underlying assembly of the evidence. Some of them have a partial assembly of evidence or just description of a few key events. And that's something that we want to overcome. We want to get more AOPs to this final stage where they've been reviewed and endorsed. And that's basically because this graphical representation alone, while it can be informative, is ultimately no more valuable to decision making than a sketch on a cocktail napkin. While it might tell us something about the biology, it's not going to hold up in court if somebody challenges the decision or asks what we used as the basis to support our inference of the potential hazard. And so credible supporting evidence is critical, and we establish that credibility of this overall graphical representation through an assembly of the supporting weight of evidence and the technical peer review of that scientific information. And so that process of evidence assembly and peer review and revision based on that peering review makes the development of a formal AOP description a rather daunting amount of work. Takes a lot of time and effort, again, pulling all together all this information to actually assemble the support for this adverse outcome pathway. And so the various stakeholders involved in this process, all contributing to this overall process of AOP development, also face a number of challenges that prevent us from taking the AOPs across that final hurdle to establishing their credibility. So for example, authors who are developing the content, evaluating and judging the level of support, often, they don't necessarily get funding to do things like knowledge synthesis. Our funding tends to be tied to the generation of new data or doing new experiments, but it's rare to get funding to actually go through and synthesize existing knowledge. There's also a lack of recognition for just a contribution to an open source wiki. It doesn't have an impact factor associated. It's not tracked the same way publications are. And so there's not the professional recognition for promotion and so on. In terms of engaging the crowd in contributing their knowledge and expanding and discussing the content that's been put in, there's a lack of awareness of the ability to comment and discuss within the AOP Wiki. And there's also some hesitance to have that discussion in a public forum. We engage reviewers to evaluate the technical quality of the information assembled, but AOPs, because they're spanning from the molecular level all the way up to the individual and population, require a broad range of expertise. And it's not common to find individual reviewers that have the entire scope of expertise needed to evaluate all elements of the AOP. And because of the extent of information involved, can often be more time consuming than a typical journal article to review. And so again, how the reviewers get credit for the time and the energy and scholarly activity they put into reviewing the AOPs. In terms of the review managers and editors, they organize and coordinate the review process, moderate the revisions and acceptance, but they find it challenging to recruit reviewers, again, with the diversity of expertise. And many reviewers are unfamiliar with the AOP framework and the underlying principles, which makes it challenging as well. OECD provides guidance for conducting this transparent review process and organizing the reviews, but the OECD staff is limited. They have lack of funding and staff time to organize a lot of ad hoc reviews. And it's a consensus international deliberative body by nature. And so it tends to move on a rather slow timeline, which doesn't necessarily match that of authors trying to show their productivity and get out their information. And finally, professional societies really have the nexus of expertise, and in some cases can also get a good view of the application and actionable science associated with this, but they have varying awareness of the AOP framework. And so with that, I'd like to pass it on to Clemens Whitweir. He's going to talk about some of the efforts that have been undertaken to think about new strategies for making science more actionable and useful for this type of decision making.
Thank you, Dan. I will share my screen now. My name is Clemens Whitweir. I work at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. And what I will share with you now is a series of slides that describes an initiative that we and a few other organizations have started a few months ago. And this process is called Science with Impact in an Era of Information Overload. And my presentation today focuses on the importance of collaboration that emerged out of that initiative. So the issue, as you all are aware, is that there is an increasing global scientific output, which is indicated by the increased rate of papers published in scientific journals. But as you might also be aware of, the parallel uptake of science in decision-making is not as steep as the global scientific output. So there is a mismatch between what scientists produce and how their science is used, especially in a regulatory context. So a few people who were very much involved in thinking about this problem decided that we need a workshop to address this issue. And we formed a coordination group out of representatives from these fine organizations. And we invited more than 40 people from these organizations to discuss exactly that issue with us. How can we make sure that science produced fine, top-notch science produced by the scientific community has more impact in an era of information overload? So the premises were twofold before we started this journey. First, the knowledge management is obviously an essential linkage that connects science with its potential impact. And the adverse outcome pathway framework, the AOP framework that Dan just described, is proposed as one example of a form of knowledge management. So in our workshop, we focused very much on the usability of the AOP framework in addressing the issue at hand. And secondly, an important role, and very, very important role to be played in this whole issue is the professional life science societies. So we knew that we had to involve the professional life science societies and, very important, their affiliated journals to address the issue. So the AOP framework as the knowledge management framework, but also the societies and their journals. And what we tried in this initiative is how to find out how can we combine these two worlds. The format was quite straightforward. As you can imagine, in 2021, there was no face-to-face meeting. We actually had planned a face-to-face meeting in 2020, but that for the obvious reasons didn't happen. So we exchanged bio sketches, we had introductory talks, we talked about the AOP's perspective in the whole story. We had breakout sessions, Slido polls, and we are currently preparing a workshop report. So we are in the final stages of coming up with the final findings of that workshop. And all results shown in this presentation are obviously only preliminary and subject to finalization. So we had this workshop. The first output of this workshop was a collection of problems and proposed solutions and a list of possible actions. This will all be part of the workshop report once we share it with a larger community. And we came up with 3 strands of follow-up activities. Strand 1 deals with communication, collaboration, and shared understanding. We identified a series of issues that need to be addressed in that context: communication, collaboration, and shared understanding. And strand 3, the technical implementation and the support to make sure that this communication and collaboration can work. And as you can imagine, there will be a strand 2, but we come to that in a moment. So strand 1, ongoing activities. We are currently, we have analyzed the AOP framework for its fitness to arrive at better regulatory decisions, and we will issue that report in a few days, actually. So we are only a few days away from the official launch of that report. Very interesting reading. It's a European Commission Science for Policy report, and will inform many parties who want to know more about the suitability of the AOP framework for arriving at better regulatory decisions. In strand 1, we plan a series of follow-up activities. We want to be more active at scientific society conferences and similar events. We will identify training opportunities and training content. And we also think about organizing Pelston workshops. Those of you who have already been involved in Pelston workshops in the past know what that is. Normally in a very remote area of the world, people are locked in together in a comfortable environment, but in a very work-intensive environment, and they are not let out of the room before they haven't come up with solutions. So we think that Pelston workshops, by the way, organized by CETAC, can be formed around the issues of tracking the science that impacts decisions, because we know that we have a problem with linking science with decisions, but we also know that we don't always track when instances when regulatory or other decisions have actually been influenced by science. So the other way around is also very important. And we want to try to find out ways of improving the ongoing engagement of scientists and policymakers in the process. Strand 3 is quite straightforward. It's more the technical implementation and the support. So we are currently analyzing the AOP Wiki for its fairness. You know what FAIR stands for. The fair knowledge needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we are doing that right now. We try to get the handle on tagging information in a more machine-readable way in the AOP Wiki. Therefore, we need to update the AOP Wiki data model, which is also currently ongoing. And we will look into how to better describe test methods and protocols in the AOP Wiki. You know that all these molecular initiating event, key events, and so on, they are measured and analyzed and observed with test methods, mostly new approach methods. But the AOP framework or the AOP Wiki is currently still a bit weak in describing what methods have actually been used. Our planned activities is have a closer look at nano publications and again, workshops in the technical area. We would be very interested in developing a topical policy app that provides concise, high quality summaries, because we are aware that there is a gap between the scientific language that scientists use and the language that policymakers, regulators are willing to understand or are able to understand. And bridging this gap in understanding and in language might be an interesting avenue to follow when we try to create science with bigger impact. And then we could also look into current publishing paradigms, knowledge tagging, FAIR principles in a dedicated Pelson workshop. So, and now let's have a look at the middle strand, strand 2, which is engagement with publishers. So we see that as a follow-up of this workshop as a thing that is in the middle between the more communicative collaboration, shared understanding strand and the purely technical strand, the engagement with publishers, which actually this workshop is all about, can be seen as a bridge between these two. So what happens when you have formed your AOP? If you were brave enough to form a team that creates an AOP, what are you normally supposed to do? You are normally supposed to publish that in the AOP Wiki, and you will get lots of friendly applause by the scientific community. But will you also get your scientific and academic recognition, the thing that you are really needing in order to progress your scientific career? Maybe not so. And another issue is that the review process, and Dan already explained how complex that review process is, and Natalie will go deeper into that, is also on the shoulders of a few volunteers that are associated with the AOP Wiki or with the AOP framework. So you remember Dan's slides, all these stakeholder roles and challenges, most of the AOP related responsibilities lie on the shoulders of a very, very few people and volunteers. So the current publishing paradigm obviously does not really reward AOP Wiki submissions. So you are supposed to submit your stuff to the Wiki, but you don't get proper recognition. And the AOP Wiki review process is often the bottleneck to a more widespread use of AOP knowledge. So wouldn't it be much better if in parallel you published your AOP not only in the Wiki, but also in a journal, or in the other way around? There are people who publish their Wiki, their AOPs in a journal, but do not publish it in the Wiki. So what we ideally want to aim at is a parallel publication. In most cases, AOP Wiki alone is enough, but if you want to have the full-fledged acknowledgement of the scientific and policy community, maybe both avenues are right. If we share then the burden of the review process between the journals and the Wiki people, I think we would find much more or quicker way to get AOPs endorsed and reviewed. And obviously, you would also get your scientific and academic recognition. We have, and that is, we have already 2 journals who have signed up to this process, and Dries and Jason will tell you more about that. So I don't want to give their story away here, but we have already started that process, that people from journals or journals are willing to help in the AOP publication process. And this is the very topic of this webinar. So if we go back to this science with impact in an era of information overload, where strand 2, the engagement with the publishers, was a clear result of that workshop, but which was already in parallel being managed by the OECD, and which led to today's webinar. We will obviously, out of this workshop, have also additional actions beyond these strands, but that's midterm future, not near-term future. And the people who ran the workshop will loosely observe what's going on there. So to summarize, what are the next steps? We will identify champions for the follow-up actions in strands 1 and 3. We will instigate these follow-up actions. We will obviously follow and closely support strand 2, which is this OECD activity which we're talking about today. And we will have a closer look at the possible organization of PELS and workshops on well-defined topics. So you will hear more from us in the near future when we come out with our workshop report. But it's great to see that this OECD activity is actually already implementing one of the 2 strands that came out as important follow-ups of the workshop. And with that, I finish my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clemens, for this great presentation. I will now share my screen and oops. Okay. Okay, good. I now focus on the OECD AOP review and endorsement process, and will present tools for cooperation with scientific journals. So as presented by Clemens, engagement with publishers is key for a closer relationship to be forged between scientists and decision makers. So why do we consider this engagement is so important for the AOP development program? Well, let me first put this into context and say a few words about the overall objective of the OECD Chemical Safety Program, under which the AOP Development Program stands. So the objective of the Chemical Safety Program is to develop standards, to develop IT tools, to promote best practices across member countries, to facilitate data sharing, knowledge management, and to avoid a duplication of resources in chemicals management. So the OECD AOP Development Program is one of these tools. It is based on multi-stakeholder cooperation. But as you remember from Dan's slide, there are various challenges we are facing. So I will specifically focus in this presentation on the challenges associated to the scientific review and how to overcome these challenges. But before I go further, I will provide a general overview of the AOP development process, which includes 3 main steps: the assembly, the review, and the endorsement. The assembly of an AOP corresponds to the scientific information being put together by scientists in a platform dedicated to AOP development, the AOP Wiki. At any time of the process, before the endorsement phase, an AOP author or team of authors can submit their project of an AOP development to the OECD for inclusion in the AOP Development Program work plan. And those AOPs included in the work plan will benefit from the assistance of a coach during their development. The coaches will help authors making sure their AOP is developed in compliance with the AOP development principles. Then comes the AOP scientific review, followed by the endorsement phase. And the endorsement by the OECD is a multi-step process, which includes EGMUST approval. Well, EGMUST is the expert group overseeing the AOP development program, and which is followed by the endorsement and declassification by higher committees, and then the publication. So one particular challenge I would like to focus on is step 3 here of the scientific review. The scientific review is fundamental as it will provide confidence in the AOP developed, and this confidence is key for the widespread acceptance of AOPs. The OECD AOP development program started in 2012, and in the first 10 years of the program, the scientific review has mainly been coordinated by the OECD. However, the OECD coordinated scientific reviews depend on funding and staff time to organize ad hoc reviews, and scientific review cannot be guaranteed for all AOPs in the work plan. So this scientific review has been identified as one bottleneck of the AOP development process, and this is the reason why we are looking for support from other stakeholders, like national institutes or scientific journals. In order to maintain the development of high-quality AOPs, the OECD has developed principles for the scientific review of AOPs, and this provides a level of standardization while retaining flexibility to ensure efficiency. These principles have been described in a guidance document on the scientific review of AOPs. This document was published last September. It provides guidance on the quality standards required for the scientific review of an AOP on the AOP Wiki. And it defines the core principles associated with AOP scientific review in order to enable consistent scientific reviews to be conducted regardless of who is doing the review. The scientific review should be independent, avoid conflicts of interest. It should be transparent in the selection of the reviewers, and the name of the reviewers, the collective outcome of their individual declaration of interest analysis, their comments, and the responses of the AOP authors to the reviewers' comments should be publicly disclosed. In addition, the collective scientific expertise of the review panel should cover the full scope of the AOP, and this can be quite broad. And the scientific review should address a standard set of predefined charge questions. So as mentioned, the scientific review step currently limits the AOP expansion. In order to make the process sustainable, the OECD is seeking the participation of scientific journals in OECD and journal cooperative activities, where the journal would participate in managing the scientific review of some AOPs of relevance to their field of expertise. And this cooperation, which takes the form of a memorandum of understanding between the OECD and a journal, aims at increasing the rate of AOP scientific reviews by distributing the burden of organizing and managing those reviews across a broader range of organizations. It aims also at incentivizing more AOP contributions by providing authors with a career recognition associated with a peer-reviewed publication, and also benefit participating journals by providing review-like articles with high citation potential. And as mentioned earlier, 2 MOUs have recently been signed with 2 journals, ET&C and EMM. So the collaboration with journals is seen as an accelerator of the virtuous circle of collaboration. It would have a direct impact, increasing the number of AOPs developed and published, leading to an increased number of AOP networks, an increased usefulness and use by regulators, an increased awareness of the AOP program, and an increased collaboration of scientists and crowdsourcing, leading to the increase of the development of new AOPs. So what are the principles of the Memorandum of Understanding? The journal signing the MOU would carry out the scientific review of the AOP in the AOP Wiki. And it's very important that the whole AOP developed in the Wiki is reviewed in accordance with the OECD guidance document for the scientific review of AOPs. In addition, if the journal requires AOP authors to develop a journal format article for publication in the journal, which is also referred to as the AOP Report, both the AOP Wiki content and the AOP Report will be reviewed by the journal peer reviewers, which is quite different from what journal reviewers are used to do and requires also more work and time. So AOPs accepted by a journal can then be considered for OECD endorsement and subsequent OECD publication, to the condition that the AOP Wiki content has been reviewed and following the OECD review principles. So in terms of publication, the journal will publish the AOP reviewed through the AOP report, and the OECD will publish the AOP as described in the AOP Wiki at the end of the OECD endorsement process in the form of an OECD working paper in the AOP series. So for an AOP developer, there are benefits to this multi-support publication. The publication in the AOP Wiki will bring recognition from the AOP community. The publication in the OECD iLibrary series on AOPs will bring recognition from the OECD community, leading to potential regulatory applications. And the publication in an impact factor journal will bring the recognition from the research community. So I will stop now and go a little bit backwards to the pre-review steps to mention that before entering the AOP review process, the journal will need to ensure that the AOP under consideration is compliant with the AOP Wiki development principles, which are described in a guidance document, which is called the User's Handbook. So this compliance check is conducted by the coaches when the AOP is on the OECD work plan. But if a journal editor wishes to take care of an AOP that is not on the OECD AOP work plan, then they would have to take care of the compliance check. And to help them conduct this, some training may be necessary. The editors of ET&C and EMM are also active members of the expert group overseeing the AOP development program, and they have a very good knowledge of the AOP framework. But we are aware that some training may be needed for reviewers and for journal editors who are not familiar with the framework. A lot of training material has been developed already and exists to get familiarized with the AOP framework, but some additional training is going to be developed specifically. For example, a training video for AOP reviewers of the AOP Wiki content, and some also training videos for journal editors on how to verify that an AOP is compliant with the AOP development principles before they decide to start a scientific review. So ET&C and EMM have signed an MOU with the OECD, and more scientific journals are invited to join this effort. If you wish to know more about the AOP development program, or if you wish to discuss further cooperation on AOPs with the OECD, you can contact me or my colleague Magda Sachana. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and we'll give the floor to Dries Knappen and Jason OBrien for the last presentation of this webinar on the case study and lessons learned from ET&C and EMM.
Yeah, you can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. My name is Jason OBrien. I'm a research scientist at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and my co-presenter, Dries Knappen from the University of Antwerp, Belgium. And I will tell you about the experience that we've had doing AOP reviews through ET&C and EMM, the two journals that have signed MOUs with the OECD. So the two journals, quite coincidentally, are also both published by Wiley, but this process can be adopted by any publisher. And we worked together, these two journals, to develop the AOP report, which is what we call the journal article that is published in the journal that accompanies the information that's published in the wiki. Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry so far has completed 2 reviews of 2 AOPs. These are now published and available, and there is one more currently under review. Environmental Molecular Mutagenesis have had 3 AOPs submitted for review, but only 1 so far has completed the review, and it's still undergoing the revision phase. But hopefully that will be completed soon, and in the weeks to come, that will be made available. Now, the AOP report journal articles were developed in collaboration between the 2 journals, and they're kind of developed to have a common kind of branding or structure between, even though it's published in different journals, there's a similar format to this article. The AOP reports are published as open access or free access, and this has been arranged by the publisher. And once the AOP's reports are published, they can be released together in a virtual issue. So even though that these reports are in different issues of the actual journals, or even across different journals, the publisher has combined them all into a virtual issue. And I believe Dries will share a link with you all so you can take a look at the virtual issue with the AOP reports that have already been published. So the AOP report is the accompanying article in the journal, and it's not intended to be a full replication and description of all of the information of an AOP in the AOP Wiki. That information is supposed to stay in the wiki, and it's actually, as Dan described, it's a lot of information. It can be a very large document, 20, 30, sometimes 50 pages long. The AOP report, on the other hand, is supposed to be a concise summary and description of the AOP and how it was developed and some of its applications. So the AOP report structure that we've come up with is that there's an introduction that gives the scientific context of the AOP, a brief description of the AOP and its context in AOP networks and the rationale for its development, an overview of the AOP development approach, what data was used, what kind of systematic methods were used to collect the knowledge and any collaborations that were involved. One of the most important parts is the summary of the scientific evidence assessment. As Dan mentioned, that's one of the most important parts for being able to use AOPs for their to make decisions based on the information in AOPs. And AOPs are evaluated based on a few properties like biological plausibility, the quality and of the empirical evidence, the essentiality of the key events, how much quantitative understanding do we have, what is the domain of applicability. The article can also describe some potential applications of the AOP. And finally, there's an acknowledgement section, which also includes the names of the reviewers and the editors that were involved in the review process. Accompanying each AOP report is some additional information. This can be appended to the article as supplementary information, and it also can be found in the AOP Wiki entry. And so the information includes a snapshot of the AOP Wiki entry as it was before the review started, kind of as a snapshot in time, because the entry in the wiki evolves over time. It also includes all the reviewer comments and author responses, and finally a snapshot of the wiki as it was at the end of the review process after any revisions have been made. So as we kind of mentioned, as Natalie and Dan and Dries have mentioned, the AOP review process is a little bit different than a standard journal review. So there's a few principles that make it quite unique. In addition to the actual journal manuscript, the content in the AOP Wiki itself also must be part of the review process. And that can make it quite a lengthy process because there's a lot of information in the AOP Wiki. The review is open and transparent. The reviewers are not anonymous. And so their names of the reviewers and all of the comments and author responses are made publicly available at the end of the process. A few other interesting aspects of the review is because they can be complex, we encourage cooperation among the reviewers. It's not always necessary. If the review is straightforward, it can be a pretty standard approach, but sometimes when more complex issues emerge, reviewers are encouraged to have discussions and coordinate to try to solve some of the issues. Similarly, if the issues are particularly complex, reviewers are invited to arrange discussions and debates with the actual AOP authors. And again, this is not always necessary, but when more complex issues arise, as they do from time to time, this tool has been very effective at resolving these issues. And finally, another difference that we've mentioned already is that the reviewers and the editors involved in the review process, their identities are made public at the end of the process. And so a brief summary of the actual review process. Natalie mentioned there is a compliance check that's done by the journal editor. This is to ensure that the AOP is compliant with the AOP development principles that have been described by the OECD. And as mentioned by Natalie, this may require some training by new editors, but if the editor is very familiar with the AOP framework, it's a fairly straightforward process. Once the AOP has been deemed compliant, a review team is assembled. This is typically 3 to 4 reviewers that are topic experts, and they have to, their expertise has to range across the full scope of the AOP, including molecular, cellular, and individual and population level effects. And ideally, at least one of those reviewers will also be very familiar with AOP principles. A lead reviewer is appointed, and you'll see why in a moment. And after the review team has been assembled, a kickoff meeting is held. And this is often necessary because the reviewers are often not very familiar with AOPs, the AOP principle, and the whole review process, which is, as I mentioned, quite different than a standard journal article review. And so here there is that the principles are explained and the overall process is described and a communication strategy is established. And some training resources are provided to the reviewers if needed. Dries will talk about those in a minute as well. After the kickoff meeting, the review process takes place. Because the information in the wiki can be quite heavy, it's a bit of a longer review process. We give 6 weeks time, but in my experience with EMM, we had to give some extensions as well. So our review was about 8 weeks or so. And then at the end, the lead reviewer is assigned to consolidate all of the reviewer comments into one consolidated final review report. And this review report is forwarded to the authors, and the authors make any revisions as necessary. And if necessary, there can be discussions held between the authors and the reviewers for any complex issues that arise. I'll pass it off to Dries to describe the next few sections.
Yes, thanks, Jason. So as Jason described, the review process is slightly different from a typical journal article review. It's quite complex. And so as we went along, we had to develop a workflow supporting the different stakeholders in the review process. So there is a number of resources that have been developed, are currently still under development in some cases, that can be made available to the authors, the reviewers, the editors. And so these are resources either that have been developed at level of the OECD, by ECMAS, or by the journal itself. And so these are resources that we certainly are also willing to share later on with other potentially interested journals. So for the authors, there is, as Natalie mentioned, the OECD Development Handbook, of course, which for the authors, the AOP developers, forms the basis for the work. But the journal also provides a set of specific instructions for authors in terms of stressing the importance of the handbook, but also how to format and shape the AOP report itself. For supporting the reviewers, we make use of the OECD's guidance document for the scientific review of AOPs, which was also mentioned by Natalie. And also an introductory video on AOP review, which is made available by the OECD. But again, also at the level of the journal, we provide a set of specific instructions for reviewers where we basically focus on the aspects that are deemed most important to primarily focus on during the review process. This document also lists the set of predefined questions that Natalie mentioned that need to be addressed during the review. So these are the materials that we have for the reviewers currently. As for the editors, again, as Natalie explained, the compliance checklist needs to be followed, and so that's something the editors do right now. But so for EMM, Jason has been acting as the handling editor, and for ETNC, Dan and myself have been the handling editors so far for AOP reports. So the current editors involved in the initiative are relatively to fully familiar with the AOP development and review principles. So it is anticipated that when new journals will join in the future, that there will also be a need to develop some additional potentially relevant training materials for supporting the editorial aspects. Next slide. So after the first couple of journal reviews, we carried out an evaluation of the review process. So we had a number of debrief calls with the reviewers, who carried out the initial reviews of the first AOP reports, and a number of surveys were done afterwards as well. And so we tried to bundle the experience and learn as we went along and refine and update our process based on the feedback we received from the reviewers. And so a number of highlights from that evaluation process are on this slide. So a number of elements to overcome some of the challenges with the review process that were considered essential by all of the reviewers were, in the first place, the extra time that's provided. So Jason already indicated 6 weeks is the standard time that we provide. In some cases that is sufficient, in some cases an extension is needed. So it really is a significant process to go through the AOP, and some a longer period of time for reviewing compared to a typical journal review, article review is definitely needed. Something that is also deemed important by the reviewers is having early access to all of the resources that are available for reviewers. So even before the kickoff meeting, so they could really prepare and get to grips with the overall concept and an idea of what they were going into. So my personal experience as a handling editor is that although it is a significant effort, all of the reviewers so far have been really enthusiastic about the initiative and really were supportive of the overall idea. But the other side of that coin is that there is a need for a lot of support for guiding the reviewers through the process and to make sure that they feel supported along the way. And for that purpose, the kickoff meeting with the reviewers is really essential, where the overall idea is explained, the relationship to the OECD endorsement process is explained, where it is explained, the review process itself, like Jason just outlined it, that the reviewers are expected to review both the content in the wiki as well as the journal article. That's really essential. And then during the review time itself, during the 6 to 8 weeks of review, there is a lot of conversation between the reviewers and the editor for any and every question they might have from technical or scientific nature, procedural nature. And so this response time is also critical to keep the review process moving forward with and leading to a review report ultimately. Of course, it was also deemed essential to have at least one AOP expert in the review team. So at least one reviewer who is really experienced in AOP development and review. And also to have one lead reviewer to write the joint review report, to take into consideration all of the different comments and suggestions that were made by the review team. So the most important challenges as perceived by the review team were, first of all, the required depth of the review, both for the AOP itself, but also for some other elements associated with the AOP. So it is not just a review of the journal article, but also of the AOP wiki content. And so that requires a more in-depth review as compared to a typical review, and that confused in the beginning some of the reviewers. So we had to explain the nature of that. But for example, in the AOP report, there is also a small section where the AOP network context can be described of the AOP that is actually the subject of the review. And so then that can lead to confusion as well. For example, where authors were wondering whether they were also required to review the other AOPs that link to the AOP that's under review at the moment. So there is really a need for the editors when managing the review team to basically define the scope very well and to outline what is the topic and what is not the topic of the review process. So that is a perceived challenge, but it can be remedied easily by incorporating a lot of that kind of information and background in the instructions for reviewers and during the kickoff meeting. A second perceived challenge is the relationship, what the nature is of the exact relationship between the OECD endorsement process of AOPs and the journal publication process. Also often from the perspective of the reviewer's own input. So they provide a review report and review comments, and typically that's only used within the specific context of the journal review process. And in this case, it might also end up at the level of the OECD and being part of the OECD approval and endorsement process. So it's very important to clarify to the journal reviewers where and when and within which context their input and their comments might be used at a later stage, even after the journal publication process has been completed. And a third perceived challenge is the relationship between the content in the AOP Wiki and the content in the AOP report. So obviously there is a lot of topical overlap between the AOP Wiki content and the AOP report content, but no verbatim text is allowed in the journal article. So that's also a consideration to talk about with the reviewers, how they should look at licensing, duplication, plagiarism. So what should they do and how should they report when pieces of text that are in the wiki are verbatim copied into the manuscript, etc. So all of these perceived challenges are exactly that. They are challenges as they were perceived in the initial reviews of the initial AOP reports that we managed, but given appropriate instructions and feedback and information, this can all easily be addressed. Next slide. So to accommodate some of those perceived challenges, the list of resources that is available to the reviewers and to the authors continues to be under development. So this is one example of an effort that was carried out recently, where the different review and publication processes at the level of the OECD and at the level of the journal are compared. So this is a mapping exercise. On the right-hand side, you can see the different steps of the OECD review and publication process as outlined by Nathalie earlier today. On the left-hand side, there is the journal review and publication process as outlined by Jason. And so this mapping exercise lists all of the different parties involved in both processes, how they relate to each other, etc. So that's just one example of additional resources that are currently being developed. A similar exercise is underway to address some of the questions around licensing issues and use of wiki text in journal publications, for example. So again, in the future, the resources available to the different stakeholders in the process will continue to be expanded. Next slide. So I just wanted to mention two successful examples in ETNC. So these are two AOP reports that have been published. The first one is on AOP 360, inhibition of chitin synthase 1 leading to increased mortality in arthropods, from the group of Knut Erik Tollefsen at NIVA in Norway. The second AOP report is from the same institute, also at NIVA, AOP report on uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation leading to growth inhibition via decreased cell proliferation, AOP 263. And I'm calling this two successful examples because these AOPs, as a result of the ETNC publications, have been added to the OECD AOP Development Program work plan and have been subsequently submitted to ECMAS for approval without further scientific review at the level of the OECD. So these are two examples that demonstrate how journal reviews can be used as a starting point for the OECD endorsement process, basically. Next slide. So this is my my last slide, and it refers back to some of the challenges that have been raised earlier by Dan and Clemens and Nathalie and Jason. So as hopefully more journals will join this initiative in the future, there are a number of challenges that might need some additional attention and consideration. So the first one is finding or training editors that have sufficient experience to ensure that the AOP is compliant to the OECD development principles, and also to ensure that the review itself is performed according to the OECD principles for AOP review. So this may in the future require some additional training materials to be developed or some other initiatives in that respect, depending on which journals and which editors would be interested in also publishing AOP reports. Similarly, depending on which journals might join in the future, finding or training reviewers might be a challenge as well, especially because there is clearly within the review team a need to have at least one reviewer with sufficient AOP development and review experience. So this should be someone who's not necessarily a specialist in the specific topic of that one specific AOP, but it should be a reviewer who fits within the overall or general scope of the journal. And so that is also something that will probably need some additional thought and consideration. And lastly, in terms of coordinating the effort across journals, OECD obviously will face some challenges in terms of implementing the MOU and communication with the journals, but also between the journals. As the number of journals increases, it will, I think, be necessary to have some level of standardized, formalized communication. For example, lessons learned across journals might be shared and helpful to other journals also publishing AOP reports. It would be, I think, a very nice idea to have AOP reports as an overall general concept across several journals. For example, journals reusing that naming convention, making AOP reports recognizable as a manuscript type across different publishers and journals. And eventually, when AOP reports are being published by different journals and different publishers, that will also bring some challenges to create virtual issues across publishers. So basically to keep track of all of the AOP reports that are being published. And for example, this could be something that could be captured in the context of the AOP Wiki. So these are a number of concluding thoughts that I had based on some of the initial experiences we had at EMM and ETNC. That's all I had. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dries. Thank you very much to all the speakers today for this great overview and presentation of the basis for AOP cooperation between OECD and scientific journals. I would like now to open the Q&A session, and as mentioned, for a more interactive session, we are giving priority to live questions. So to ask a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Maybe I will first start with two questions that are very relevant to what we have just discussed, and from the Q&A session, and then we will move on to the hands. One question is how a journal can start an official collaboration with OECD on AOPs. Well, we just need to get in touch with me, for example, at OECD, and we'll start discussing the modalities. There is a summary of the MOU, which is publicly available, and you can have a look at this document, and then we can have teleconferences together and discuss the modalities of the cooperation, and then the MOU can be sent to you. And the next question was, does the OECD have a list of AOP expert reviewers? Is there an accreditation process? So yes, there are. I mean, we don't have lists, but we work with the working group of the national coordinators for the test guidelines program. So when we need to consult experts on a specific domain, we contact this working group of the national coordinators, asking them to get in touch with their networks and asking them to nominate or put us in contact with experts in a given field. And this can, of course, be done also for journal reviews. And if a journal is looking for specific experts, then we can contact the WNT, the Working Group of National Coordinators, and help the journals look in their research for reviewers. So now the first question will come from Masaki Tsukano. So please go ahead. Masaki, you have to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Okay, now.
No, I don't have any questions. Sorry.
Okay.
It's a mistake.
No problem. The next question will come from Ioana Katsidaki. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I couldn't see how I can mute or unmute myself, Natalie, so hopefully someone has taken care of this. So excellent initiative from all, and congratulate your perseverance in moving things forward. It wasn't clear perhaps from the presentation is these processes are going to be a little bit parallel, or they can follow on each other. For example, the wiki with the publication, and what, for example, in a scenario where you have a fully developed AOP that has been through the peer review process and is accepted, but then it gets stuck for reasons that those associated with OECD WNT can understand, for example, and then not be approved at this stage. Would this be an issue for the developers? Are they just going to have a paper but not a wiki? Have you thought about how linked these two parallel processes would be? For my own benefit, perhaps it was stated, but I didn't understand it.
Who would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I guess I can comment on that a bit. The process as it stands right now to do this joint publication between the journal and the AOP Wiki, the content in the AOP Wiki has to be fully developed when the journal article is submitted. So they're basically part of the same submission, and that snapshot of the AOP Wiki content that Jason talked about is part of the actual submission package. And so as it goes through the journal review process, both the manuscript, the narrative manuscript, as well as the content of the AOP Wiki are reviewed at the same time. So they basically are proceeding along the track together. So there really shouldn't be a situation where one is done and the other is not, or it wouldn't be accepted into the review process if both pieces weren't there. And then in terms of the possibility that it wouldn't get endorsed afterward, I mean, that is always a possibility, but I think in general, because going through the coaching and the technical review process and so on, it puts the AOP in a very strong position to be endorsed eventually. And there may be some feedback from the OECD, perhaps a couple revisions that need to be made to take it to that next level for endorsement. But I think, it definitely going through this process certainly helps it along that track. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That's very useful. Perhaps then an arrow between the two processes might have been very helpful for us to understand, in the graph that Dries presented. But I was wondering if the OECD is able to meet DOIs, then would these two be linked at that level, as one is, I don't know, like we do with data, for example, data paper, and the other one, the narrative, basically, which is going to be more useful for the wider audience. Have you thought about this and discounted it?
Yeah, the two different publications, the journal article and the wiki entry are linked together. The publication has a link to the snapshots and the wiki page, and the wiki page, it's also if in the history section of the wiki entry has links to the review documentation, that thereby linking it to the journal article as well.
And the publication on the OECD website also has a DOI and links also to the review reports and to the wiki.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it happened yet, but those first AOPs, once they are published in the OECD publication series, will presumably have links to the AOP report articles DOI as well.
Thank you. So the next question will come from Paul Jennings. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So I'm representing Toxicology in Vitro and Elsevier journal. So I think this is a great initiative, but I wanted to actually ask Dries specifically about what you said about the verbatim copying. I'm not really sure that's true, because a lot of people have these preprints now and they're pretty much verbatim. And if that could be, I mean, if we could get some clarification on that from the journals, that would help a lot, because to try and rewrite a piece of scientific text twice would only do damage to one of them. So are you absolutely sure that that's a policy of journals, or is it just a worry?
No, it is a policy currently that the AOP report is in a narrative format and that it tries to describe the information in the wiki in a slightly different way. That's more in a narrative format, as I said, to basically summarize the information without going into all of the details. And so it is not the idea to verbatim copy paste the text that is currently in the wiki. And I think that's also part of the MOU. Because the OECD series publishes the content as it is in the wiki.
No, it's just, sorry to just further clarify, because, you know, even though I understand what you mean, but a chunk of really well-written paragraphs are very hard to rewrite. So is this rule coming from your own wiki? And is there any chance to have a little bit of leeway there? That, okay, the whole text shouldn't be, or, you know, because there's actually legal definitions of what is plagiarism.
That is correct, but the reality is that this is a challenge that needs some further thought, and that, as I said, some initiatives are currently ongoing to provide additional guidance on that issue. So it does relate to the legal aspects related to publication in the wiki and the licensing that's applied there, which is currently very open, but that's not necessarily something that is going to be kept in that way. Also depends on what the MOU at the level of the OECD prescribes and what the journals themselves have as a policy. So basically the answer to your question is really complex mix between different players and stakeholders and legislations. And so this is something that will require some additional thought and guidance to provide a definitive answer to your question, I think.
No, thanks, Chris. Thanks.
I would just add that I agree. Sorry, Dan. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think, you know, the perspective of the publishers and the journals and their understanding of all the legal issues associated with publication, I think could be really valuable here in understanding, you know, where those borders are and what can be allowed and what's not allowed. So I think more journal participation in that regard would be really helpful.
Yeah, as I said, I don't see an issue from the journal side, or at least I don't perceive an issue. But
I just wanted to say that I appreciated Paul's comment. The process of AOP development is already quite a lot of work for AOP developers. So we don't want to introduce any additional bottlenecks or hardship. So if there's a way that we can get around this and make things easier for people, then I think it's worth exploring.
Thank you. The next question will come from David Josephy. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm an editor for Mutation Research. It's been an interesting presentation. Certainly a very interesting and attractive prospect to get involved in this. As an editor, my major day-to-day challenge is finding reviewers. And it seems, and that's not usually easy, as any editor will tell you, I think. So my major reaction to what I've heard is, how do we get, I mean, the review process for this kind of project strikes me as being not just one, but maybe 2 orders of magnitude greater than the review of a regular paper. It's just a much bigger task involving training and much more work and consultation and meetings and collaborations and so on. So what about the challenge? How do we identify reviewers? And I mean, are academic reviewers going to feel that the reward they're getting for doing this is in any way commensurate with the amount of work involved? I'm just practically worried about that. Your reactions, please.
I definitely agree with you. The finding reviewers has been a challenge at times, especially reviewers with expertise in AOPs. Natalie talked about I can't remember what she called it, the circle what did you call it? But yeah, a cooperation, and hopefully as the idea and concept of AOP grows, this problem will become less and less of an issue. Already at some universities, AOP principles are being taught as courses. And so people are becoming more and more familiar with the process. So it's definitely a slow start. At the OECD, the review process was very slow. It took, I don't even want to say, it took a very long time to get those first reviews done. But then as the experience in the community is growing, the process is going smoother and smoother. So yeah, there will be growing pains. But I anticipate as the concepts become more common, especially as more journals adopt this paradigm, that challenge will hopefully ease. But definitely at the beginning, there will be some challenges identifying the correct expertise. And that's why we've developed the training materials.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that from my personal experience from a couple of AOP reports so far, I found it actually easier to find reviewers compared to typical research articles for which I often have to do more effort to find a sufficient number of reviewers. It's to be seen how that scales, of course, and it will bring challenges when the number of AOP reports increases. But I had a feeling that a lot of people, either reviewers already were quite familiar with AOP concepts and framework and just understand the importance of publishing AOP reports and wanted to support the initiative for that reason. And on the other hand, there were reviewers who are not so familiar with the framework, but were really interested and enticed by the idea and were joining just because they wanted to learn more themselves as well. So it could also, from that perspective, I think, be quite rewarding for these reviewers in terms of their personal learning experience as well. So, yeah.
Maybe just as a follow-up to that, I mean, I'm just wondering, coming from an academic background, is there I mean, I can understand that I could imagine it would be a lot easier to find reviewers from a regulatory background or a government background than it would be for academics. I mean, maybe that's okay. I just wondered if that's the case. I mean, regulators are generally going to be much more attuned to this sort of challenge than academics, I would guess. Not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just wondering about it.
So far, my feeling was that it was a good mix, but sample size is small so far as well. So
I would agree that
Okay,
generally the AOP program has been mostly adopted by the regulatory community. And that's one of the reasons we decided to reach out to the scientific societies and journals, is to get more involvement. And hopefully, again, this will cause some growth and interest in the scientific community rather than just the regulatory community.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to add that, as mentioned at the beginning of the Q&A session, in the context of the collaboration with the journal, the OECD can provide support finding reviewers using the networks of scientists from the test guideline national coordinators. Maybe I will give the floor to Ioana, who suggested that she could provide her perspective on this question.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. Although I do come from a government / regulatory background, I just wanted to inform the person, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, that posed the question, that it's not actually all that different. It's applying expert knowledge at the end of the day in a domain that one is familiar. And with very good guidance from the OECD, it's a longer process, but it's not a much more difficult process. At least I've reviewed at least 6 or 7 AOPs so far for the OECD Wiki, and I found it highly enjoyable. However, you're right. Perhaps the interest is because I work in a regulatory and government environment. So it's more the academics that we need to train to be a little bit more focused on the review, because they have a specific purpose rather than a general interest. Anyway, again, it's not something completely new. That's my bottom message, is applying expert knowledge to assess the strength of associations between events. So, I think we're all used to do that, whether we work for academia or government. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We are close to the end of the webinar, and I would like to take the last question from Daniel Dietrich. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, this is Dan Dietrich. I'm just going to be a little bit of a critical question. And I guess this is mostly directed towards Dan, being one of the original developers of the AOPs. Having had interactions with the OECD for numerous years, I realized that we can bring up rules or AOPs or guidelines, but once they're there, they stay there. That's quite unfortunate. So what is your turnaround time in upgrading AOPs once they have been accepted and installed? Because as we go and as our research evolves over the 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to have to update the AOPs to make them more precise. So I think that is really a critical part. And have you foreseen this in any which way?
I mean, it's been foreseen in the motivation behind the AOP Wiki in the first place. I mean, that's why we opted to use the AOP Wiki as the way to get this information out to the community, the synthesized information, with the recognition that the science should continue to evolve over time. The evidence and the support for the AOPs should continue to evolve over time. The journal review process and the OECD endorsed AOPs are actually endorsing a snapshot in time of that AOP. And so it's really incumbent upon the authors or other contributors to continue to evolve that AOP in the AOP Wiki. And so even if there is an endorsed version of the AOP that has been published by the OECD, for example, that corresponding AOP in the wiki can continue to evolve, and it can be put into another round of endorsement later on if that AOP is advanced. So for example, perhaps the first time the quantitative understanding wasn't that strong. And so if over time that quantitative understanding improves to the point that a higher tier sort of application becomes something that's able to be done, that AOP could then be submitted for another round of review and endorsement. But the onus is really on the developers, the people contributing the content, to want to put it through that next round of endorsement to say, yep, we've elevated this or improved this to the point that we think it's worth an update and a endorsement of a new version. Otherwise, it will just continue to live on and grow and expand and develop within the AOP Wiki itself.
I just want to point out that it does happen and has happened. At first, now that we're growing, the AOPs that have been reviewed are now beginning to evolve, and some of them are even seeing second rounds of reviews. So it does occur.
I mean, the point I'm trying to make is, do you have a program within your framework where you plan to revisit AOPs every 10 years, for example? And I think this is critical. If you put in stringency with regard to publishing AOPs, as you have right now with the journals and with the OECD, I think it is of utmost importance that you actually do a 10-year revision, because in many cases, some of the authors, original authors, may no longer be active in research for whatever reason, and they will not be the instigators of a revision. So it is up to the OECD actually to take that onus and start moving in that direction.
Yeah, for the moment, we don't have a 10-year plan, but because the very beginning of the program just started 10 years ago. But as Dan mentioned, it really depends on the progress that has been made on one particular AOP. In that case, I mean, of course, the AOP published on the OECD website would be updated. I don't know if any other panelists would like to add to that.
Well, you have a bit of a monitoring. I always cut you off, Dan. Sorry.
That's all right, Jason, go ahead.
We have a bit of a sort of monitoring program for AOPs that are currently being developed, that are sitting in the wiki and not evolving to the point where they're reviewing. We have what we call a gardening process, where we have people that review all of the status of the various AOPs in the wiki and contact the authors to see if they plan on progressing the AOPs. And so I can see kind of evolving that into checking the ones that have been reviewed as well. It'd be a similar process to check the status for updates. So we have something similar, but just not for stuff that has been reviewed already.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point and a good idea. It's just a matter of organizing implementation of it. And in the end, it'll still be, you know, if we decide a 10-year update is needed, there's still a necessity to find contributors who can provide that 10-year update. So, but I mean, it's a point well taken for sure.
Thank you everyone. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to all the participants, all of you who joined, and thank you for your interest in this topic. So we are looking for more cooperation and being developed in the future, and don't hesitate to contact any of us. We'll address the written questions in the Q&A box that we didn't have time to address by email. So you will, if you have sent us a question in the Q&A, you will hear from us soon. So with this, I would like to wish you a nice day, afternoon or evening, everyone. And thanks a lot for joining. Thank you, bye.